We're moving right along. Thank you very much. That was an excellent panel. Really interesting to see how all the partners are working together to do some very, I think, innovative projects on the ground. Suzette, you're going to be talking about Cape Town, South Africa. Good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So as Cassie said, I'm Suzette, and I'm going to be talking about Cape Town. And but there's never an opportunity for a Cape Townian to not show you a picture of the mountain, the Table Mountain. And this is actually one of the properties that form part of the City of Cape Town's public housing portfolio, which I'd like to tell you about. I've made some really nice slides, and I'm very disappointed that you're not going to be able to see them, but use your imagination. So first of all, I work for an organization called Zutari, which is a consulting engineering firm. We support clients with like full life cycle infrastructure service delivery. I specifically work in the advisory business, looking at how we can support particularly public sector clients with huge infrastructure portfolios, how to better create, realize, and kind of translate the value of the assets that they have. And we sort of look at the full life cycle of this. There's a lot of things to think about at the same time. So the project that I want to tell you about is a project that has dominated much of my time since joining the company in March last year. But not just does it dominate my time at work, it also dominates my thoughts all the time. So I'm very excited to talk about it, and you'll hopefully find it as interesting as I do. So to frame this research at this stage are just a couple of questions. And I think the research at this stage doesn't answer so many questions as much as it raises questions. And also, I'm just going to out the gate say, I don't question the existence of publicly subsidized housing. So don't fight with me about that. I also accept the fact that the City of Cape Town has a legacy housing stock of public housing, and they're obligated to take care of that. This is part of the departure point as well. And then also what this case study specifically talks about is whether or not the private sector can really start offering some kind of solution to publicly subsidized housing. So the project is known as the City of Cape Town's Public Housing Turnaround Project. It's actually been a project ongoing for 3 years now. So it started firstly as how we could support the City of Cape Town's Public Housing Department to look at improved maintenance processes. In the second year, we started looking at a little bit more sort of all-round business processes and how we might improve those. We also started looking at the strategic direction of the department and public housing as a whole. And then in the final year, we were kind of looking at continuous improvements. So how do we continue to improve maintenance and customer service processes? And then also, and this was the question that kind of came out of the strategic study, was how do we start looking at alternative models and what might this be? So just to give you an idea, the City of Cape Town's public housing, and that's this little block over here, is a department under the Human Settlements Directorate at the City of Cape Town. And their responsibility is to plan, manage, and maintain the public housing portfolio and then administer the lease agreements with tenants. So I don't have to tell anyone at a housing conference or conference about affordable housing that affordable housing is a public good. The availability of safe, dignified, and affordable housing enables more people to participate in the economy. It reduces inequalities, it creates better urban environments, and all three of these things collectively enhance overall societal well-being. So with this in mind, you're all probably also equally familiar with subsidized housing in South Africa. So given that apartheid meant that majority of populations, both urban and rural, were unable to own and build on land, housing became a huge part of the post-apartheid agenda. So you may have heard of the Reconstruction and Development Program. The RDP program was a mass kind of, it was an integrated approach to spatial reform, but a huge part of it was around the delivery of housing. And this morning, the Human Settlements Director spoke about the kind of numbers that we're looking at here, and up to 3.4 million houses have been delivered to date, 1.1, I think, serviced sites as well. But the unfortunate news is that the housing backlog today remains about as much as the housing opportunities that have been delivered to date. So naturally, a government is not a housing institution, and I mean, all of you understand the basics of economics. At some stage, the model becomes incredibly unsustainable. So as an alternative to rent to housing, subsidized housing in the ownership model, which is the model on the left, where you kind of have a provider and you have a beneficiary, and a housing opportunity is granted to a beneficiary. The problem with this is that the demand of housing keeps increasing. There is an incredible strain on the supply of new housing and housing opportunities. And given all sorts of economic constraints, which have definitely been made worse through kind of adverse challenges of climate change and global pandemics, the fiscal base is drastically shrinking. So the amount of money coming in is also less. So quite obviously, a rental model starts making a lot more sense for how one can provide subsidized rental housing. So subsidized rental housing allows for some form of revenue to be garnered from the provision of subsidized housing, which kind of closes the loop to an extent. So the way that rental housing, I think I broke it. Did I break it? There we go. The way that rental housing in affordability speaks to providing affordable housing can happen kind of in three main ways, but along the spectrum of private to public. So when the private sector does housing, they typically call it affordable housing. And here you have private sector developers that are benefiting possibly from state subsidies in the form of incentive schemes. And then on the kind of other extreme end of it, of the spectrum is the product that I'm talking about, which is public housing, which is government provided, typically at the municipal level. It's government developed, and there is technically an ongoing individual subsidy. And then sort of in the middle between public and private sits social housing. Some of you might be familiar with the social housing program in South Africa, where private sector developers receive a capital subsidy of up to 2/3 of the development costs, provided that they then provide housing for earners in this income band of between 3,500 Rand and 22,500 Rand. So what you'll also notice is that when the private sector does affordable housing, there is no eligibility criteria. Often when the private sector is catering for housing, they are actually able to provide housing for people who are typically ineligible for state subsidized programs. And then kind of when social housing does it, the income band is typically a little bit higher, but what public housing does, and this is kind of where the intricacy starts coming in, is that public housing caters for households that earn below 3,500 Rand. So as an idea, if you are earning minimum wage in South Africa full time, you're earning around 3,700 Rand per month. And this is household income. So you can understand why even that starts becoming a problem. So just a little bit about the housing portfolio. The city of Cape Town owns around 55,000 units. A unit is quantified either as a freestanding house, an apartment, or even legacy hostel rooms that are still part of the portfolio. And we kind of took an approximate number and said that if you kind of look at 3.4 people per unit, you're looking at between 3 and 5% of Cape Town's population that occupies these units. The units are also located in some of the most densest populated areas of the city. So this map kind of shows the concentration of units, and it also shows the high density. And what we'll also find is that in Cape Town specifically, high density areas are your lower income areas. So what I'm trying to say by this exactly is that this public housing portfolio caters for the needs of the most poor. So some challenges that arise, or at least let's start with the facts. Public housing is completely state owned and managed. The rentals are far below market value. The municipality is able to provide housing at a rate in the city of Cape Town of around 22 Rand per square meter, which is pretty sweet in Cape Town. The eligibility criteria is determined by household income. As I said, you earn less than 3,500 Rand as a household. And then there is also very little churn. So because of how the subsidy program works, tenancy transfers are possible. So if a member of the family who is the listed beneficiary dies, they can actually transfer that to their family members, provided their family members are still eligible for the less than 3,500 Rand income. So as you can imagine, when I give you those numbers, there are significant challenges. The rental rates are incredibly low. In fact, the rates are lower than the cost of operating this. That's me. indigency is incredibly high. So even though you need to earn less than 3,500 to get a unit, you can immediately apply for indigency. Indigency implies you are unable to make your contribution, where a payment plan is worked out. And up to 46% of the rental income is actually written off. The collections rate is very low. So first of all, we've now written off 46% of the rental we could charge as a result of indigency. Only 33% of the billed rental is actually received. And the operational costs are incredibly high. So just as a basic percentage, it's about 280% of the revenue that's received is how much it costs to operate this. So now we're sitting with a problem. There's a huge deficit. The municipality ends up having to make up this deficit. And this deficit is sometimes in the range of 184 million per annum. And the source of the subsidy, as you can imagine, is not a very reliable source. When emergency strikes, it's this pool of money that typically gets redirected to other things. So even though sustainable rental housing is incredibly important, and it is incredibly important for the public sector to contribute to the public good that is housing, at some point, we cannot bank on this money. So something really has to change. And this is where this question around public-private partnerships came in. And is a public-private partnership the answer? So first of all, just to understand what are the dimensions of a PPP in the provision of subsidized housing. So typically, when the private sector does housing, they do it better. And that is no secret to any of you. Essentially, the aim behind involving the private sector in subsidized housing provision results in better services being provided and also a reduced demand on an already strained fiscus. So this is why this might be an attractive option. So what does a PPP entail? Typically, PPPs entail the private sector's involvement in what was traditionally public functions. And it's a really attractive way to channel private sector specializations, skills, and resources, and sometimes capital, towards delivering public services. And PPPs can also take many forms. Majority of them are around procurement. But what we're looking at here, as you can imagine, is more of an operational exercise. And then typically when a PPP is set up, we determine what is the kind of structure, the incentive structure, how do we share responsibilities? And kind of at the core of it, PPPs are around risk transfer. So determining which party is better equipped to handle which risks. Yes. So how do we move the public housing model towards something that has more of the private sector involved? So if you remember, there was a scale from private to public. If we were to go kind of more towards the private side, social housing starts becoming a really helpful benchmark of what it might look like when the private sector is more involved. So let me tell you something about social housing. So in a social housing model, you have the government through an institution that provides up to 2/3 of the development cost to a developer. The developer then provides social housing to eligible households. Now, the eligibility, as you'll remember, is a little bit higher than for public housing. They then manage, maintain, and kind of plan for the units into the future. And they are able to then get a certain rental for that unit. This rental is what would be deemed affordable, if you look at the World Bank's affordability definition. And then the developer is really only liable for 1/3 of the capital cost. Now, this is why the model kind of works, because the developer can kind of make their money back with less than optimal rental, and they're only really liable for 1/3 of that rental. That rental is typically a portion of equity. It's often on like lent from development institutes, and other times it's cross-subsidized where developers have kind of commercial property in their portfolio as well, and that kind of thing. So the model works really well, but some things that are really important, I'm not going to talk about all of them, is their operational cost benchmark, according to the institute that governs them, is around 1,100 Rand per unit. And you'll remember that I said public housing is incredibly expensive to operate. And then also they have to have collection rates of up to 85%. And in order to have this, and I can't remember who said this earlier, I think it was, I don't know, but the hardest thing about rental property is management. And the reason SHIs are able to do what they do is because they are incredibly hands-on. SHIs often have a 1 to 200 kind of management ratio, so one hands-on person per 200 tenants. City of Cape Town is dealing with around 1 to 2,500. So that's that's kind of, yeah, that's kind of the numbers that we're looking at here. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but when you are looking at kind of risk transfer, and you're trying to see where the private sector is possibly able to help, what we've done is kind of broken up, and this is a very brief summary, the types of tasks that are involved in actually managing the public housing stock, and then looking at kind of what are the requirements, so what needs to be in place for this to work, and then also kind of what are we looking at risk, and then also from that, what are the possible kind of performance indicators that would be used. These are the things that you need to know if you want the private sector involved. These are the things that the private sector wants to know. So I guess then the last question remains kind of what are the obstacles that remain in actually making the shift and bringing the private sector more into providing this. And this very, oh, that's not changing. There we go. This very, oh, it's really great. Okay, so a couple of things happen. And the reason I kind of use this diagram is that there are kind of major things, and this is definitely not an exhaustive list, but this kind of explains the complexity of how interlinked these things are. And the text is quite small, so I'm going to just tell you kind of what it says. But at a social level, there is a lot of social issues associated with public housing. Housing is a notoriously political issue in South Africa, which I explained, which is not new to you. But also, if you're looking at areas where the most poor and vulnerable communities live, specifically in Cape Town, you have issues of substance abuse, you have issues of gangsterism. These are issues that are always going to be rife in this type of housing. And these are the kind of issues that you're facing. And then, I mean, on top of that, there is this skewed financial model. So if you don't have enough revenue coming in to cover your costs, that's already a huge challenge. And then also, if we're looking at our lowest earners, some of them can't even afford these drastically reduced rental rates. And then what this brings in, and that's probably the least attractive thing for the public sector, is the risk. There is so much unpredictability and so little control that the private sector actually has in the event that they got more involved in this, that at this point it's just unattractive or completely too expensive for the public sector to get them involved. And then finally, and this is kind of, in this question of control brings about like the regulatory issues. It is incredibly complex. There's all sorts of regulations that govern how municipal assets can be dealt with and potentially put in the hands of the private sector. So there's a lot of constraints that happen here. So, I mean, I guess the question is what can be done? I don't really have an answer, but I do have some ideas. So, first of all, it's impossible to eat this elephant all in one go. And one singular approach is unlikely to be the answer. So I think that segmentation is really a incredibly important departure point, and segmentation at different levels. So first of all, you need to segment out the operations. So what are the tasks that are involved? Because some of these tasks might be more appropriate for getting the private sector involved because they're better at it. Some of them might be governed by regulations or kind of legal frameworks. And it's really important for us to see what are the different pieces and how can we break them up. And then finally, it's really important for us also in doing that to segment the finances, because right now it's really hard to see which of these tasks costs how much and which one generates how much revenue. Then, which is quite obvious coming from an architecture background, segmentation of the portfolio in a spatial sense is really important. And we've started looking at where some of these properties are located, kind of what's happening on the sites that they're located on. And this might allow us to treat different sites in different ways. And then kind of following on this is tenant segmentation. At the moment, the only criteria that we have to determine tenants is how much they earn, but you'll know that there is so much more to people and types of people, and it's really important to understand who are the different types of people who live here, because potentially there are different approaches to different groups. And then kind of the opposite of segmentation is the idea of integration. That it's important for us, and this holds true for the from South Africa looking at the Department of Housing and shifting it to human settlements. We are starting to take an integrated approach, but I also think that there is room for integration across different housing modalities. How do informal settlements get dealt with? How does social housing get dealt with? Public housing, all of these different things, and how do we integrate our approach and take into account what everyone else is doing? And similarly, integration at different levels of government. Just because the municipality has to manage the public housing doesn't mean it is the municipality's problem or that they're the only ones who have to deal with it. And then similarly, integrated service delivery. So how do we look at the rollout of service delivery in such a way that it can actually better support public housing. And by services here, even though I come from an engineering firm, I'm speaking about social services. I think that there is a lack of support and social services in these spaces that is critically necessary, and all the money in the world is not going to fix them. And then I guess that touches on my second point, which is around socioeconomic imperatives. One of my sort of heroes in the world, Nabil Hamdi, wrote a book called Housing Without Houses. And I think about this as housing finance without finance. It's really important for us to start looking at the kind of other socioeconomic imperatives associated with affordable housing, because to just give people access to homes without giving them access to any means to pay for those homes, whether they own them and have to maintain them, or whether they rent them and have to continue paying the rent, we're kind of setting them up for failure. And then I guess the final point really, and the reason I kind of offered to have this conversation, private sector integration. What is the private sector doing? How can we integrate what the private sector is doing in how this is happening? And how can we kind of bring them into the fold? And by private sector, I don't just mean private developers or private finance, I mean development finance as well. It's important for us when we think about integration to kind of also integrate as many different sources of finance in this as possible, so we can kind of crowd in the finance. I'm convinced that a blended option is kind of obvious at that stage. And that's my story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzette. You've given us so much to think about.